Hello and welcome to one of my pre-ptr heroic Icecrown Citadel boss guides, where I've gone through and looked over old YouTube VODs, online forums, and Wowhead pages to try and produce a modern, up-to-date boss guide with as much relevant information as possible. I'll try to present each encounter in the most straightforward way that is applicable to everyone, then leave the discussion of boss mechanics, assignments, and logic for later in the video. Now before we get started, if you'd like to see more WoW content or want to help my channel grow, consider dropping a like, subscribing, and sharing this video with a friend. It really helps me out, and I appreciate the support. Otherwise, thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Lord Marrowgar is a two-phase encounter. Your raid will need 3 tanks, 4 to 6 healers, and the rest DPS. The enrage timer is forgiving at 10 minutes in length, so running more healers may prove helpful. In Phase 1, have the entire raid, excluding hunters, stacked behind the boss, inside its hitbox, specifically the red circle that appears on the ground when targeting the boss. Position your tanks on the opposite side of the boss outside of the red circle. Tanks need to be stacked for Bone Slice and alternate moving between 3 spots to avoid taking excessive damage from Cold Flame. By the time your tanks get to the 3rd Cold Flame, the first Cold Flame will despawn, freeing up this space. When Lord Marrowgar casts Bone Spike Graveyard, DPS be sure to focus down the spikes and free impaled raiders. After 45 seconds, Lord Marrowgar casts Bone Storm, and Phase 2 will begin. Have your raid spread out to avoid taking excessive damage from Bone Storm. Lord Marrowgar will target and move towards random players during this phase. The boss will continue using Cold Flame and Bone Spike Graveyard. Don't stand in the fire, and continue to DPS down spikes to free impaled raiders. After 30 seconds, Lord Marrowgar's Bone Storm ends and the encounter returns to Phase 1. Repeat these 2 phases until the boss is dead. In Phase 1, we have the raid stacked in the boss's hitbox to manipulate the boss's first mechanic, Cold Flame. This ability deals 11,000 fire damage per second on heroic, and in Phase 1, Cold Flame will target a random player, spawning just outside the boss's target circle and move radially outward from the boss towards said player's last known location. So if we position the raid inside the circle, they cannot be hit by this ability. With this setup, Cold Flame will then target a random raider that is a further distance away, which happens to be the tanks. Cold Flame is not a difficult mechanic to avoid, but moving the responsibility to your tanks enables your damage dealers and healers to worry about their DPS and HPS respectively. In Heroic, by the time the 3rd Cold Flame patch spawns, the 1st will expire, so your tanks will alternate moving between 3 locations. If tank damage is a concern, have your tanks utilize 4 spots instead of 3, to avoid having to run over existing Cold Flame patches when moving to a new spot. Their movement will look like this. Note that because Bone Slice splits damage between the main tank and their 2 closest allies, tanks need to ensure they remain stacked, and the raid needs to ensure they never end up being closer to the main tank than the off tanks. The other relevant mechanic this phase is Bone Spike Graveyard. Lord Marrowgar will impale 3 raiders in 25 man, dealing 10% of their health per second for 5 minutes, or until broken. The benefit to having the raid stacked up is that DPS can cleave and AoE the spikes down. Players can also be freed through Blessing of Protection. Note that if your raid has a hunter that is outside of the stack, they can be targeted by both Cold Flame and Bone Spike. This is not a big deal, simply have your hunters sidestep the flame. Then, should they be targeted by Bone Spike, having a paladin bop the hunter is valuable, because by being outside of the stack, DPS would otherwise need to commit more of their single target damage off of the boss and onto the Bone Spike in order to free them. If your raid is having difficulty stacking properly, or your tanks are struggling with their movement, you can alternatively have everyone spread out as much as possible during Phase 1. This means tanks will be targeted by Cold Flame less, but the entire raid now needs to be wary of Cold Flame spawns and move accordingly. Furthermore, raiders impaled by Bone Spike Graveyard will require more attention for the same reason as discussed in the case of the hunter. Therefore, I would generally advise against this strat. Once Lord Marrowgar casts Bone Storm, Phase 2 begins. During Bone Storm, Lord Marrowgar will fixate and move towards a random player roughly every 5 to 10 seconds, dealing about 11,000 damage every 3 seconds that drops off with distance. Assuming the raid was stacked for Phase 1, players will need to quickly spread out. Have a paladin use DSAC to offset some of the initial damage during this time. You can have your raids spread out randomly, but I would recommend assigning quadrants within the boss room for players to move to. This is because Cold Flame will continue to spawn, cutting off sections of the room, and the boss will continue to use Bone Spike Graveyard, impaling random players. By assigning players to certain sections of the room, you lessen the likelihood somebody gets impaled by a Bone Spike, with no healer near enough to heal them or DPS player near enough to break them out. And finally, there is a strategy worth mentioning that was utilized where the raid stacks in the middle of the room during Bone Storm, with 2 players on either side. On private servers, Lord Marrowgar would tend to target the furthest player from its current location. This means the boss would bounce between the 2 furthest players, presumably 2 of your tanks, allowing the raiders in the middle of the room to stay planted. Melee would continue to DPS the boss at max melee range. Casters could cast without needing to move, and players targeted by Bone Spike Graveyard would be stacked together, making them easier to break. However, by being closer to the boss, this strategy means the raid will be taking more damage during phase 2. So this strategy is contingent on 2 things: whether your healers can heal through the damage, and if Lord Marrowgar does in fact target the furthest player during Bone Storm. The answers to which we'll have to wait and see come the PTR. After 30 seconds of Bone Storm, the boss transitions back into phase 1, and these 2 phases repeat until the boss goes down. Otherwise, that's it. Again, thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more ICC guides coming soon. See ya.